The Chakras Istanbul, 2016. The retired teacher will be forgotten, Adnan said one more time. Nothing shocks us anymore. We've become desensitized, but, darling, aren't you being a bit harsh? What else can we do? Asked the businesswoman. Otherwise, we'd go mad. At these words, the psychic joined in with an impatient toss of his head. Nations have a zodiac sign, like individuals. This country was born on the 29th of October. Scorpio, ruled by Mars and Pluto. Who is Mars? The god of war. Who is Pluto? The god of the underworld. The planets say it all. Astrological mumbo-jumbo, said the religious newspaper tycoon. What do you mean by gods when we all believe in one Allah? The psychic straightened his back, looking offended. The entire Middle East has its chakras blocked, said the journalist. No wonder, the businessman interjected. The only energy they know is oil. Talk about spiritual energy. So which chakras in your professional opinion need to be opened? Asked the businesswoman, ignoring her husband's remark. The fifth, came the answer. It is the throat chakra. Stifled thoughts, unexpressed desires. It starts here at the back of the mouth and puts pressure on the esophagus and stomach. A few guests touched their necks. Speaking of which, my throat is dry, I need to open up my chakra, said the businessman. Kazim, bring us more whiskey. The psychic went on. There's a technique that can be used to unblock a nation's chakras. Is it called democracy? Perry suggested. The plastic surgeon checked his watch. Oh, gosh, it's late. I'd better get going. I've got an early flight. Although he had settled in Stockholm many moons ago, he often returned to Istanbul, where he had business interests and, according to rumors, a lover young enough to be his daughter. Fine, you'll disappear and we'll deal with the mess, the PR woman said. Those who went away in search of better lives in foreign lands were at once envied and belittled. It wasn't about New York, London, or Rome. Those who stayed behind, it was the very idea of life elsewhere. They, too, longed for new skies to walk under. Over breakfasts and brunches they made elaborate plans to move abroad, almost always meaning the West. But their plans, like sand castles, slowly eroded with the rising tide of familiarity. Relatives, friends, and shared memories anchored them. Little by little, they forgot their yearnings for another place, until the day they ran into someone who had actually done what they had once wished to do. That's when resentment kicked in. The plastic surgeon sensed the mood against him. He said, Sweden isn't paradise either, a feeble line of reasoning that convinced no one. Come tomorrow he would travel back to Europe and leave them alone with their problems. He would eat cinnamon buns while they would be dealing with regional instability, political turbulence, and bombs. Perry smiled at him in sympathy. Not easy to stay, not easy to leave. She wanted to explain that those who stayed behind, despite the hardships, enjoyed lasting friendships and wider social networks, while Theans who migrated for good remained incomplete, jigsaw puzzles missing a critical piece. Well, how tragic he has to live in the Alps, said the journalist's girlfriend, who, despite her boyfriend's nudges, was still drinking. The Alps are in Switzerland, not Sweden. Someone tried to correct her, but the journalist's girlfriend ignored the comment. With her tummy tucked into her tight miniskirt, she jumped to her feet and pointed a painted, half-chewed fingernail at the plastic surgeon. You lot are deserters. You go and live abroad in comfort. We're the ones who deal with the extremism and fundamentalism and sexism. And, she turned around as if looking for another ism nearby. It's my freedoms that re in danger. Speaking of danger, the hostess turned to the psychic. Darling, I must show you the house. Only you can tell me why we've had so many freak accidents. First, there was the flood, then the lightning. And did you hear about the ship? Sailed straight into the mansion, like an action movie. She glanced at her husband to check if she had forgotten something. The tree, said the businessman helpfully. Oh, yes, a tree fell on our roof. Do you think it's the evil eye? Sounds like it. Never underestimate the power of envy, said Thepsi Sheik. Did you have the maids' rooms checked? One of them might have put a curse on you. You think they would dare? I'll throw them out in a heartbeat if we find anything suspicious. The businesswoman felt her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Where would you like to start? The basement. If you are looking for a jinx, always check the darkest corners. As the psychic and the hostess brushed past, Perry picked up a vibration. Another second passed before she recognized it was her husband's phone. She paled. Shireen was calling back. Teacher, a scholar of integrity. He had managed to shake her, motivate her, challenge her. She had worked harder in his seminar than in any other class. He had shown her the poetry in wisdom and the wisdom in poetry. In his seminars all were welcome and treated equally, regardless of their backgrounds or their views. If there was anything as held sacred, surely it was knowledge. She adored the way the last rays of sun tinted his hair gold and the way his eyes sparkled when his mind flew as he spoke about a favorite book or a beloved philosopher. She adored his love of teaching, which at times felt even stronger than his will. So many tutors taught the syllabus, year in year out, while he improvised in every class. In his universe there were no routines, only risks worth taking. She remembered him quoting Chesterton, "Life looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is, its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden, its wildness lies in wait." But then, as infatuated as she was with him, she abhorred his air of superiority, his bloated pride, the hubris that infused his whole being. Had dismissed the worries of others, indoctrinating students with his own perspective, exercising a form of power over them, often at the expense of hurting their feelings. She imagined his hand running through Shireen's hair and down her neck. It was more than she could bear. The thought of the two of them together, talking, laughing, making love. These were the scenes that played non-stop in her mind when her head hit the pillow at night. How close Asa had been to Shireen, while he had remained aloof and inaccessible to her. Only when he had learned about the otherworldly episodes she had with the baby in the mist did he pay more attention to her. For him she had been yet another scientific experiment, another source of curiosity. He had quickly lost interest in her, like a spoiled child with a new toy. She loathed the avarice he conflated with the spirit of inquiry, the vanity he hid behind academic research. She could not tell which upset her more, that he had been secretly sleeping with Shireen or that he had refused to love her in the same way. He had burst into her life and left destruction in its wake. Yes, she would testify against him. Shireen and Mona had been deeply shocked when they heard about Perry's suicide attempt. As soon as they were allowed to visit, they had come bringing nothing but their concern, etched on their faces. They were bent on finding out why she had done it, a question Perry didn't know how to answer. Shireen had also begged her to give evidence in Asa's defense. She had asked her to save her darling professor. Was it because Shireen trusted her and saw her as a dear friend, Perry wondered, or did she simply think that she, Mouse, was easy to manipulate? Be objective, she told herself. Separate your feelings from facts, that at least you owe to Asa. Make sure you aren't driven by emotion. He taught you how to do that. Regarding his affair with Shireen, well, they were two consenting adults, neither exploiting the other. As for Troy's motives in seeking to bring him down, were they entirely selfless? On a bench in the Botanic Garden, each question piercing her mind led to a more complicated one. The psychiatrist had told her it was best to put off making serious decisions until she was feeling better, stronger. But how could she do that under the circumstances? Perry felt lost, the thin rope mooring her snapped and she drifted in unknown waters, not sure which way to swim. Soon she would appear before the committee members. What would she tell them? What kind of things might they ask her in return? Her feelings swirled in circles, with such speed that she was not sure she could put them into words, least of all in front of strangers and in a language other than her own. She checked her watch. Her heart pounding so hard it could have burst through her chest, she stood up and began to walk towards the building where Professor Asa's reputation would be on trial. Swathed in the tranquility of his college rooms, Asa sat at his desk staring out of the window. He tried not to let his mind dwell on the outcome of the committee meeting. It weighed heavily on his conscience that people who loved him might get hurt at the end. He knew Shireen would be grilled with questions about their affair. She would try to disguise the truth to protect him. Fruitless, he reasoned, since he had already decided to tell everything straight out. He had nothing to hide. He had done nothing wrong. Troy, too, would be summoned. He would unload the pack of lies he called truth. He had never liked that boy. Sneaky. Good thing he had kicked him out of the class. Over the years he had heard many stories of students and professors clashing over political definitions, historical views, and soon. For his part, he had rarely been bothered by differences of opinion. Every year one received a few difficult cases, students who wanted to show how clever, how special, how far above their peers they were. And that was fine. It was Troy's attitude in the classroom that had put him off. Bossing other students about, ridiculing anyone he didn't agree with, calling people names, following them after hours and bullying them with his opinions on God. At first he had thought Troy's presence would provoke everyone into thinking more clearly, but it had quickly become clear that most students felt intimidated by him. So he had thrown him out of the class, leaving the boy excluded, hostile, dangerously vindictive. Asa was aware that his critics, who were plentiful, were rubbing their hands, thrilled to anticipate a scandal unfolding with him at the center. Some openly wished him to be sacked. There was a certain type of person who rejoiced in another's miseries, as pointless as a man who expected to fill his stomach with someone else's hunger. And Perry, beautiful, timid, fragile, self-reproaching Perry. What would she say about him? He was not worried about her. After all, the accusations regarding Perry were baseless, and he felt sure she would be objective honest. She would testify, if not for him, for truth, which would amount to the same thing. In his hands Asa held an imaginary set of scales, the pros and cons of his case resting on each palm. Against him, pressuring students with assignments that some might deem objectionable, even offensive, causing some of them to break down in class and to collapse psychologically, and of course, having an affair with the irresistible Shireen. In his defense, his long years of teaching, research, and work, his contribution to intellectual and academic life, his productivity in turning out books and articles, and the fact that Shireen, the only moral aspect of his file, was not his student at the time their affair began. Despite the best attempts of Troy and his allies, the case against him was weak. He had always reasoned that if you didn't know how to take a punch, you wouldn't know how to win a fight. Even so, he could see how vain he had been. He had wanted to develop God into a language that was, if not spoken, at least understood and shared by many. God, not as a transcendental being or a vengeful judge or a tribal totem, but as a unifying idea, a common quest. Could the search for God, when stripped of all labels and dogmas, be turned into a neutral space where everyone, including atheists and non-monotheists, could find a discussion of value? Could God unite people, simply as an object of study? It was a mental experiment. I fetch soul on earth completed God, as Hafez claimed. What would happen when unlikely individuals were put in the same room, made to look each other in the eye and encouraged to complete one another's understanding of God? He admitted being demanding, and controlling, at times. True, he had used his classroom as a laboratory. But it was all for a good reason. The students, disadvantaged in knowledge, advantaged in age, quick-taughted and self-centered to the core. It never occurred to them that their teachers, too, had a story, a secret, a life elsewhere. Asa had created a Tower of Babel with them. He had pushed them as far as he could. He had failed. One great mistake had been to become involved with Perry. It had piqued his interest that a girl this quiet and withdrawn had a hidden side, in touch with what she called the mystical. Perry, more than any other student in his seminar, had a personal dispute with God and he had been attracted to that. Yes, he had spent extra time with her, even though he saw, for how could not? The girl had feelings for him. She was too young. Too naive. Too bottled up. He should have been more careful, but when was the last time he was? Asa himself had not been raised in a religious household. His father was a wealthy English entrepreneur, whose happiness was inversely proportional to his success, his mother a talented but frustrated Chilean pianist who was filled with resentment at not having received the recognition in her lifetime that she thought she deserved. His family had a business in Havana, Cuba, where Asa was born. His father told tales of shark fishing with Ernest Hemingway, though little evidence of that remarkable friendship remained, save for a few photographs and handwritten notes. Asa had chosen philosophy as his calling in defiance of family duties and expectations. However, to make his parents happy, he had agreed to major in economics, which he did, at Harvard. In his last year at university, his life changed when he began to take classes with a specialist in Middle Eastern studies. Professor Nassim had challenged young Asa like no one had done before. From an Algerian Berber family, he had exposed Asa to different cultures and shifting perspectives and uneasy questions. He had also introduced him to the works of mystics, Ibn Arabi, Meister Eckhart, Rumi, Isaac Luria, Ferdinand Adder, and his Conference of the Birds, and his favorite, Hafez. One afternoon Asa visited Professor Nassim at his house in Brookline. It was there that he met Nassim's younger daughter, Anissa. Big hazel eyes, dark curly hair, and a vivacity that touched and kindled everyone around her. They talked endlessly, about books, music, politics. She dreamed of moving out to her own flat. But wherever I live, I must see the water, she said. The same evening Asa was invited to stay for dinner. Of course the food was good, unlike anything he had tasted before, but it was the easy laughter and the Arabic melodies that mesmerized him. Anissa's eyes darted over his face in the candlelight. In that moment Asa wished that this were his family. How different was their spontaneity, their unforced effervescence from the measured politeness he knew from home. To this day, Asa wasn't sure whether he had fallen in love with Anissa or with her family. Less than 7 weeks later they were married. Before long the young couple discovered how incompatible they were. Anissa lived mostly in her own mind. She was fiercely possessive and extremely jealous, and prone to emotional breakdowns, sometimes for the stupidest reasons. She had been on medication since she was a teenager. Anissa had an older half-sister, Naur, from Professor Nassim's first marriage. Considerate, thoughtful, kind, every time the family would get together, she would sit at the table next to them, listening to the conversation between Asa and her father, asking probing questions. Slowly, Asa began to see her in a different light. The sweetness of her smile, the brightness of her gaze, the delicacy of her fingers, the sharpness of her mind. She respected his views. He respected hers. Never before had Asa thought that such respect in itself could be a source of attraction. The same year, at the end of the summer, Asa and Naur crossed a threshold. The family soon found it out. Professor Nassim, that fine old man, summoned Asa and shouted in his face. The veins on his neck were bulging blue creeks. He accused his young prodigy of acting like Shaitan, sneaking into his home with the sole intention of destroying his peace and hard-earned reputation. Asa and Anissa moved out and managed to make up. They decided to jet away from Boston. Start afresh in Europe. It won't follow us, your shame, Anissa said. Shame can't swim oceans. She never stopped talking about it, though, not openly but through insinuations and sarcastic remarks, convinced that no amount of remorse on Asa's part could mend what had so badly broken. In some incidental way, she seemed to savor her husband's sin, which gave her a moral advantage in their marriage, a sense of righteousness sweeter than ripe berries. They arrived in Oxford, with a view over the water, where Anissa seemed to adapt easily and Asa quickly found his feet. He thrived here. His wife was welcomed by the Oxford community. What no one who met her could see was the depth of the darkness gnawing at her soul. When happy, she was euphoric. When sad, she was crushed. In joy or in sorrow, It was always extremes with Anissa. She was 4 months pregnant when she disappeared. Early in the morning, the mist hanging close to the ground, she went walking down the river and never returned. Her body was found 26 days later, even though the police divers had repeatedly searched the river. There was an article about it in the Oxford Mail carrying a photograph of her in her wedding dress with a spring blossom wreath. How they had got hold of that photo Asa had never worked out. Her death was being treated as unexplained, the police spokesman said. Foul play was not suspected. The coroner gave an open verdict, but Asa became obsessed with that watermark, the unexplained. Professor Nassim blamed Asa and his affair with Nour for Anissa's mood swings and sudden disappearance. The family never forgave him, nor deep within did Asa forgive himself. It made him hypersensitive to apologies, though. He hated it when people asked for pardon for trivial things when there were bigger apologies in life that could never be expressed. Between the free thinking of his upbringing and the justice-orientated faith of Professor Nassim, he tore open a space for himself. He would teach the unexplained. He would teach God. As the morning wind mellowed into a breeze, Perry approached the committee hearing in a dreamlike state. Her legs felt heavy and stiff. The sun hid behind a cloud, a swift soared overhead, and it felt like another season, as though the world had changed since she had left the botanic garden and the dawn redwood that had shaded her. Troy was pacing back and forth at the entrance. Shireen was sitting at the stairs, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes swollen from crying. Each was keenly waiting for Perry to arrive so that they could pull her over to their side. Somewhere inside that building were people with impenetrable expressions and impertinent questions. Where was Asa, she wondered, and what was going through his mind? How she wished he were next to her now, so they could shelter inside one of the many fantasies she had about him. They could walk past these people, oblivious to their judging stares, unaffected by this calamity that had struck them out of nowhere. She wished it were nighttime and that he would talk to her about poetry and philosophy and the paradox of God, words that flew in the wind like sparks from the embers of open fires, only two of them under a sky that could have been anywhere, a dreaming university town or a teeming city, her head resting in the crook of his neck. She wished for all the differences in their ages, status, and cultures to evaporate into the air. She wished for him to lean over and touch her face, kiss her lips, and speak her name like an incantation. She wished for her mind and her heart to fuse into a blade that would destroy the spirit of Shireen that resided within him. It was so long since she had desired anything this fervently. Perry pulled her coat tight, feeling the cold penetrating her skin. If she testified on his behalf, as she felt morally bound to do, maybe he would understand how much she cared for him and he would love her, at least a little. Maybe. Yet in her heart she knew none of these things was likely to happen. His name would be cleared and he would celebrate it with Shireen, who always got whatever she wanted. From a distance, Perry thought all these things. Then, slowly, as if she had run out of energy, she stopped. Was she not the girl who had watched her twin brother choke to death and not cried for help? Always in between, afraid of drawing attention to herself, unwilling to choose sides, so focused in not upsetting anyone that in the end everyone was left disappointed. Despite all her attempts to change herself, she wasn't strong enough to overcome the emotional paralysis ingrained in her soul. She, Perry, Nazbari Rosa, Mouse, would not testify. Neither now, nor later. She was not an actor but a mere spectator. This was their problem. Their stupid game. She turned back and walked away as though it were a stranger's good name at stake and not the future of the man she had loved, dreamed of and desired with all her being. Years had to pass before she came to the realization that her passivity actively contributed to the ruination of the man she loved. When she betrayed Asa, she betrayed the truth. The Wardrobe Istanbul, 2016. A third man, his face half covered with a bandana, had joined the intruders. From the way he spoke, he seemed to be their leader. He must have waited outside in the garden while the other two had barged into the mansion, clearing the way for him. Do as we say and nobody gets hurt, he roared. Yet he sounded neither angry nor agitated, Just cold, detached. Your choice. Perry realized she was shaking. Her heart thumped inside her ribcage. Should she run or hide? Who were these men, organized mafia, ordinary robbers, or terrorists, all of whom populated Istanbul in great numbers? Or was this about money? How many people had the businessman pissed off? Ash accumulated money and envy in equal measure. She recalled his troubled expression on the terrace. But there was no time to contemplate. Eyeing the kitchen door from the passage where she found herself crouching, she paused. She couldn't run in there without being seen from the drawing room. She took a step backwards. Her hands felt the surface of the mirror behind her. It moved slightly, the door of a built-in wardrobe. She pushed it open. Inside there were coats, boxes, shoes, umbrellas. Without thinking, she jumped in and pulled the magnetic catch closed. Her back pressed against the wooden plank, she hunched up into a tight ball in the dark. Once again in her life she became a terrified hedgehog. A minute later, maybe less, somebody stomped up and down the corridor shouting, "Get out of the kitchen! All of you! Now!" They were rounding up the staff. The chef, the assistant, the maids hired for the night. Hurried footsteps. The heavy tread of boots. Frightened whispers. Inside the wardrobe, Perry clicked the mute button on the mobile and typed a message to her mother. "Call the police, urgent." "You know where I am, damn," she said, realizing Selma had probably gone to bed and might not see her text until the next morning. She felt immensely relieved that Deniz had left, and was safe. But Adnan was here, there. Her husband, her confidant, her best friend. Her breath came out in a sharp whimper. She heard a thud. A woman screamed. Perry picked out a cry, which devolved into hysterical laughter. It sounded like the girlfriend of the famous journalist. "You didn't see them coming? You call yourself Apsi chic, psychic my arse." Clutching her knees, Perry froze. Was all this about the businessman getting his just desserts? Or was it merely a coincidence, another chance occurrence that one tried in vain to make sense of? She remembered these security cameras and barbed wire she had seen at the entrance, all to no avail. The world was full of danger. Chaos and disorder lurked around every corner. Was evil some sort of divine retribution for our actions, or the fickle workings of an arbitrary fate? If randomness ruled, what point was here in trying to be a better person? How did one atone for past sins if not by changing one's ways? She had been good, except to the man she had loved years ago, and, in some untouched corner of her heart, still did. Professor Azza had taught her that uncertainty was precious. But what if confusion was all there was to it? Sick to her stomach, she dialed the police. An officer picked up and instantly began bombarding her with questions, treating her less as a witness than a criminal. Perry cut him off in the most muted tone she could manage. "There are armed men, can't he hear you?" "Speak louder," the officer reprimanded. Perry gave him the address. "Why are you in that house?" said the officer. "I am a guest," she hissed in frustration. "They've got guns. Where are you in the house?" asked the officer, but did not wait for an answer. He wanted to know her name, what she did, where she lived. Useless questions. She had been an exemplary citizen all this time, but in the database of the state she was a digital creation, a number without asterisk. Finally, the man said, "Okay, we'll send out a team afterwards." She checked the battery. It would last for another 15 minutes or probably less. She wondered what would happen in the interim. Would she be discovered and taken hostage along with the rest, or would the police arrive and launch an operation, during which they could all be rescued or killed? Perhaps by the time the battery died, this last supper of Turkish bourgeoisie would be over for good or bad. Life often felt unjust, but death was the bigger injustice. Which was harder to accept, that there was a hidden purpose in this madness, if one only knew where to look, or that there was no logic at all, and therefore no justice. Her hand was throbbing again, as if it had a mind of its own, the arm of an octopus. In the phosphorescent light from the mobile screen, squeezed in among the racks of coats and shoes while outside her husband and friends were hostages, she held up the number Shireen had given her. She called Asa. Fearsomely well researched, the article had destabilized Asa, pushing him into a depression so intense it was impossible for him to recall a time when his world wasn't suffused with melancholy. Nevertheless, he had kept on working, as though he knew that if he stopped writing he would have no reason to look forward to another day. Work was a survival instinct. He could have gone to America or Australia and started all over again. But he had chosen to stay. Without administrative and teaching responsibilities, he had found plenty of time to read, research and write. This, combined with a new fire that had seized his soul, had motivated him to publish one book after another. Each of the titles he completed in all these years propelled him forward into fame and recognition, so that today he was at a point he would have never reached had he not lost his post. Perhaps Plutarch was right, after all. Fate did lead those who were willing to be led, and those who resisted the idea, like himself, were dragged forcefully instead. He still lived in the same house with the bay windows looking into the woods. In the garden he grew culinary herbs and vegetables, socialized with a handful of old friends, no more. He cooked. Life was quiet, ordered, and this was how he wanted it. He still had lovers, several, and it no longer mattered whether the women he shared his bed with were affiliated with the university. There was something paradoxical about public disgrace that, insofar as it robbed one of social roles and respectability, was liberating. Yes, he was as free as a bird and almost as unconcerned. But he knew, of course, that birds were creatures of habit, therefore not exactly free, and had plenty of things to worry about. Every now and then he received a call or email from a journalist set on interviewing him or a student writing a thesis on his books. He accepted some, refused others, acting purely on impulse. In the beginning, he had adamantly rejected every attempt to intrude on his private space. He was aware that the first question they would ask him would be about the scandal, despite the amount of time that had gone by. Even if they did not bring it up in the interview, there would always be a mention in their piece which could be worse. So he had refused for as long as he could. Beauty and accessibility had only rendered him more alluring in the eyes of his readers. He had a loyal audience who knew, read, and shared everything he produced. As one journalist had put it, among the most read thinkers of the times, he was the most revered. After Spinoza passed away, he had refused to take care of another dog. The decision had not lasted long. A 2-month-old Romanian shepherd puppy had appeared at his door with a golden bow attached to his collar, a birthday gift from Shireen. Thick, white fluffy hair with pale grey patches all over. Calm and clever, an animal made for the mountains. It seemed apposite to name him after the Romanian philosopher famous for his saturnine views on God and everything else. Besides, it suited Asa's mood. Henceforth it was Siren who accompanied him on his walks. This afternoon, Shireen had knocked at his door, her belly huge, her cheeks aflame. Pregnancy made some women more beatific in appearance, and she was one of them. If ever there was a sinner saint, it would have been her. You're going to come, right? Please don't say no. I'll raise hell, she said, tapping her bright green manicured fingernails on his table. Shireen had become a fine academic. After the scandal she had gone to Princeton, from where she wrote him almost every day without fail. Upon her return she had found a teaching position at her old college. Since then they had remained good friends, despite the age difference and their discordant lifestyles. That neither of them had tried to revive their past affair was commendable and the right thing to do, but also sad, Asa had thought. He knew he was getting old. Look, this man is awful. Racist. Homophobe. Islamophobe, poor Mona would have had a heart attack. He has no shame. He says God speaks through his mouth. Asa smiled. There are many of them, get used to it. I won't, Shireen said. Please come. What do you want from me, darling? You think my presence means anything to anyone, least of all to him? I'm a walking disgrace in their eyes. Besides, I stopped debating God. Don't do it anymore, I don't believe that for a second. Just come, please. After she left, he made himself tea and sat at the kitchen table. A ray of sunlight slanting through the foliage of the sycamore tree outside formed a mottled patchwork on his face, accentuating his chiseled features. A local newspaper was folded beside him. There was an article about the Dutch scholar known for his contentious views on Islam, refugees, gay marriage and the state of the world. He claimed direct access to God, a privileged club membership. For near on 2 centuries the Oxford Union had invited eminent outside speakers, ranging from conventional to controversial. But no one could remember such a hue and cry as there had been for this one-man address. As a lifted the teacup, leaving a stain on the newspaper that circled the speaker's head. Now the man looked holy indeed. He stared at the image for a moment, transfixed. Then, on impulse, he grabbed his jacket and his keys. 20 minutes later, as Asa approached the building, silhouetted against the overcast sky, he noticed a group of students waiting outside with placards protesting against the speaker, demanding that he should be turned off university soil. A young man stopped him. A fresher by the look of him. He would not know. Asa, we launched a petition to stop this monster, will you sign? His English was accented but easy on the ears. Isn't it a bit late? Asa said. The man will be speaking in 10 minutes, doesn't he matter? If we collect enough signatures the union will have to think twice before inviting someone like him next time. Besides, we are planning to go in and interrupt the talk. He thrust a ballpoint pen and a pad in front of Asa. Sorry to disappoint you, Asa said, but I won't sign. A look of contempt crossed the young man's face. So you agree with him? A fascist. I didn't say I shared his worldview, but the student, having already lost interest, turned back and walked away, a fast shuffle. Asa felt torn between letting him go and catching up with him. Wait. He hurried after him. The student stopped, surprised. You're Muslim, right? A cautious nod. You've read Rumi, I presume. Remember the line? If you are irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished? What? Let this guy speak. Ideas must be challenged with ideas. Books with better books. However stupid they might be, you can't shut down people's voices. Banning speakers is no way to go. Keep your high-flown philosophy to yourself, he said. No one has the right to insult my religion and what's sacred to me, but imagine how free you'll feel if you can rise above this man's hatred. We must answer insult with wisdom. Is that your Rumi again? Actually it's Shams, his companion, and just leave me alone, the young man said before he strode towards his friends, and whispered something to them. They all stared up at Asa. Why couldn't he ever hold his tongue? This tongue that had caused him enough trouble in life already. Running his fingers through his thinning grey-flecked hair, he entered the Oxford Union. There was a poster at the entrance with the title of the talk, Save Europe for Europeans. A tense excitement buzzed among the crowd that had gathered in the hall. Some had arrived here with feelings of anger, disdain, and disbelief towards the speaker, who had made a career out of being insulting and derisive, some with a smug satisfaction that someone was finally saying aloud what they had been thinking. As Asa inched his way through the audience, a few colleagues from way back waved at him, while others pretended not to have noticed him. Shame was a cloak of invisibility. He wore it in public. It did not hurt him, not as much as before, observing just how readily people judged and distanced themselves. At times like this, he thought about Peri, wondering what she was doing in Istanbul, what kind of a life she had built for herself. If he had been condemned to lifelong disgrace, she must have been condemned to lifelong remorse. Who could possibly tell which was harder on the soul? Seeing him coming, Shireen stood up, waving, one hand on her belly. Her excitement was so touching Asa felt sad. It wasn't his cowardly accusers or opportunistic rivals who had made him feel vulnerable. It was those who, no matter what, loved and respected and supported him regardless. They had waited for him to clear his name. This he had refused to do. He had always thought that the more you protested your innocence in front of voters, the more you would be incriminated in their eyes. Besides, opening up old files would have hurt Perry too. Thank you for coming, Shireen said. I knew you would. I am going to leave early. Don't think I could stand him till the end, she agreed. In a little while the speaker walked on stage, tireless in an electric blue cashmere suit. He spoke for 30 minutes about the dangers awaiting Western civilization. His voice undulated in a calculated rhythm, dropping now and then to a hoarse whisper, rising upon words that he knew would induce fear. He was not a racist, he said. Certainly not a xenophobe. His favorite bakery was run by an Arab couple, his private doctor was of Pakistani origin, and he had spent the best holiday of his life years before in Beirut, where a cab driver had recovered his lost wallet. But the doors of Europe had to be securely bolted. It was the only logical consequence of an entire omni-shambles created by others. Europe was home. Muslims were strangers. Even a 5-year-old knew one did not invite strangers into one's house. Everyone in the world envied the wealth of the West, and it had to be protected both from the outsiders and the Judases within, who did not see that diluting a culture, adulterating a race, defiling a heritage was wrong. Wrong. Interracial and interfaith marriages, they all endangered the integrity of Western society. We should not be ashamed to talk about purity. Racial, cultural, social, and religious purity. He was eloquent, well-mannered, and, like all good demagogues, knew when to crack a joke. Europe's problem was that it had abandoned God. People were finally waking up to this historical mistake. It was time to bring God the Savior back into academia, back into the family, back into the public space. Freedoms should never be confused with godlessness. Europe had been wasting its time debating foolish subjects, like same-sex marriage, while barbarian hordes were massing at our gates. If people chose to be gay, fine, but they had to bear the consequences. They could not lay claim to marriage, clearly stated as a covenant with God between a man and a woman. The present turmoil, terrorism, refugee crisis, Islamic extremism on European soil, was God's way of teaching Europeans a lesson. Testing, correcting, honing, perfecting. In the past the Lord had rained down fire and brimstone on sinful cities, today he rained refugees and terrorists upon us. Every age brought its own punishment. My friends, God is here with us today. They tried to banish him from universities. They have offended him for so long. But he is present in all his glory. I'm nothing but his vessel, his humble mouthpiece. From his seat in the audience Aziz scoffed, loud and bold, piercing a moment of silence in the hall. All eyes turned to him, including the speaker. Whom do I see before us? We are honored by the presence of Professor Azza, if I'm not mistaken, the speaker said, though not a professor anymore. Whispers rippled across the hall as colleagues and students craned their heads to get a better view of the unruly listener. Azza stood up. Beside him Shireen sat still, her face as white as a ghost's. You are right. I don't teach anymore. His mouth turned down, the speaker said, yes, I heard. It even reached to a quiet little corner in Amsterdam. A fake smile of sympathy spread across his face. But I'm pleased to see with my own eyes how God has brought you back to the light. Who said I'd been in the dark? Azza said, well, it's obvious. Azza nodded. Then I must give you hope. I've been all things unholy. If God can work through me, he can work miracles through anyone, maybe even open up a closed mind like yours. How splendid of you to quote Saint Francis. For your own purposes, I presume. It's what people do. Someday we must have a debate. It'll be fun. And with that the preacher moved on, leaving Azza still standing up, itching to engage in a debate that would not be granted anytime soon. When he returned from his evening walk, still reliving the moment at the Oxford Union, the house felt chilly. The photographs on the walls, the tiles by the fireplace. As he was heating a lasagna from the day before, his phone began to ring. An unfamiliar number, it looked international. Not in the mood to talk to anyone, he decided not to answer it. It stopped halfway, a moment of dead silence. Siren by his feet gave a little whimper. Then it started ringing again. This time something inside nudged him to pick up the phone. And he did. On the other end of the line, from a seaside mansion in Istanbul, was Peri trying to find her voice. The Three Passions Istanbul, 2016. Breathe in. Breathe out. For a moment, time seemed to have melted away and she became the girl she once was, catapulted from a bad dream or thrust into yet another. The wardrobe she had climbed into was like her brother's prison cell. Meanwhile, outside, the guests and the staff had been taken upstairs to the gilded office. Peri had heard their footsteps as they were herded together, but now an ominous silence had descended on the household. She tightened her grip on her husband's phone as she waited for the ring. A sudden lump formed in her throat as she heard Aza's voice at the end of the line. Hello. The familiar timbre brought tears to her eyes. Her mouth felt as though it were full of tiny particles, fine grains of remorse. It was frightening the speed with which the shared past, like liquid pain, flowed into the silence of the present. Hello? Who is this? She almost hung up, so sharply did the words abandon her. Yet she was tired of running away from herself, and the impulse to confront her fears propelled her forward. Aza, it's me, Peri. He repeated and paused, as if the very invocation of her name embraced the totality of things, the good and the bad and everything in between. Her mind was racing. Her pulse was racing. Yet when she spoke again her voice sounded calm. I should have called you before. I acted like a coward. Aza remained silent. He had known this moment would come, but had never planned for it. What a surprise, he said at last. He seemed about to say something else but changed his mind. You all right? Not really, she replied without dwelling on it. She did not tell him there were armed men in the house. Nor did she say that this conversation could be cut off abruptly, as her battery was running low. She heard a dog bark in the background. Spinoza. Spinoza is dead, my dear. I'm hoping he's in a better world. She began to cry, silently. I owe you an apology, Aza. I should have spoken in front of the committee. Don't blame yourself, he said gently. You were in no state to make a sound judgment. You were too young. I was old enough. Well, I should have been more careful. That took her by surprise. So he had not hated her all this time, as she'd feared. Instead he had taken it on himself. I read your latest book, she wanted to say. I have read every single title you have published since. You have changed. You sound more cynical, dispassionate. And I wonder if that means you've lost your restlessness, the playful spirit that could charm your students and mesmerize entire audiences. I hope not. From upstairs she heard the distant drum of footsteps. A brief commotion. Someone yelled. A gunshot pierced the air. A thud. Peri's whole frame went rigid, her breath coming in rasps. What was that? Asked Aza. Nothing, she said. Where are you? Inside a wardrobe in a posh villa in Istanbul that has just been taken over by thugs, in my mouth the taste of fear and a truffle named Oxford. No, she couldn't tell him that. Does it matter, she said, keeping her voice impossibly low. He said, when I met you, Peri, I thought, this girl doesn't know it but she carries the three passions of Bertrand Russell, the longing for love, these arch for knowledge and the unbearable compassion for the suffering of mankind. Her face clouded over. You had all three of them, he said. So deep was your need for love. Your thirst for learning. Your sensitivity towards others, to the point of self-effacement. I felt for you. But I also felt angry at you. You reminded me of a woman I had known. Your wife, she asked cautiously. No, my dear. This was someone called Naur. I became anxious that I could hurt you just like I had hurt her. The truth is, I know I've ended up harming every woman who's reached out to me except Shireen. True, she was invincible. She seemed so. She was younger, but she was strong, stubborn. A natural-born warrior. Next to her there was nothing to worry about. Nothing bad would ever happen to her. You wanted a love devoid of guilt. Maybe, Asa said. You see, you're not the only one apologizing to God. On the screen the battery turned from black to red. Would you do something for me? Go ahead, I'd like to have one more seminar. Now he laughed. What do you mean? On what? On forgiveness and love, she said. And knowledge. I'll beat the professor this time, deal? A wary pause. I'm listening, dear. Well, she said. Today's lecture is on Ibn Arabi and Ibn Rushd of Uros. Ibn Rushd was an eminent philosopher, Ibn Arabi a young and hopeful student. When the two of them met for the first time, they immediately felt a rapport, as they were both devoted to books and learning. Gond neither embraced the orthodoxy. But they were also very different. How? You see, it's the same question, east and west, isn't it? How do you increase your knowledge of yourself and of the world? Ibn Rushd had a clear answer, through reflective thinking, reasoning, studying, and Ibn Arabi. He wanted both reason and mystical insights. He believed it was our duty as human beings to expand our wisdom. But he also recognized there were things beyond the limits of the mind. Before they went their separate ways, Ibn Rushd asked Ibn Arabi, one last time, is it through rational consideration that we unveil the truth? And what did Ibn Arabi say? He said yes, and he said no. Between the yes and the no, he said, spirits fly from their matter and minds from their bodies. He thought none was more ignorant than those who seek God, and yet only those who pursue a truth bigger than themselves have a chance to attain it. Tell me, Perry, why were you interested in this story? Because I was always in that limbo between yes and no. No stranger to faith, no stranger to doubt. Undecided. Vacillating. Never self-confident. Maybe it made me who I am, all that uncertainty. It also became my worst enemy. I saw no way out of it. She paused. I told you about the baby in the mist. If not a hallucination, it was a type of experience you had never heard of before. Another scholar would have scoffed at it, sure, but you didn't. You were always open to the new. I admired you for that. You think you were the only one confused. But many of us are us. A sigh of a word. So tiny, so huge. We the confused. Perry shook her head. I admired you too much. Now I can see it clearly. When we fall in love we turn the other person into our God. How dangerous is that? And when he doesn't love us back, we respond with anger, resentment, hatred. She said, there's something about love that resembles faith. It's a kind of blind trust, isn't it? The sweetest euphoria. The magic of connecting with a being beyond our limited, familiar selves. But if we get carried away by love, or by faith, it turns into a dogma, a fixation. The sweetness becomes sour. We suffer in the hands of the gods that we ourselves created. I must be one of the last persons on earth to be considered a god. Asa said. It wasn't you, Perry said. It was the Asa I had created for myself. The own I needed in order to make sense of my own fragmented past. That's the professor I was infatuated with. The Asa in my mind. So she continued. Her voice building in strength, her eyes now fully adjusted to the dark, a mobile flickering in her injured hand. She gave a lecture to a man in a house outside Oxford while his dog waited patiently by his side. It could easily have been the other way round, he in danger, Shine safety. Today she was the tutor, he, the pupil. Roles shifted, words never stayed still. The shape of life was a circle, and every point on that circle weighs at an equal distance from the center, whether one called that God or something else altogether. She heard the sound of sirens closing in on the seaside mansion. In a few minutes, no more, everything was going to change, a new beginning or an end too soon. As the phone gave one last beep before it died completely, she opened the door of the wardrobe and stepped out.